In 52 BC, a Roman army, outnumbered 5-1 and trapped deep in enemy territory, began to build a prison for itself. This is the story of how 60,000 soldiers built two massive walls, one to keep an army out, and one to keep an army in, setting the stage for one of the most audacious and consequential gambles in military history. To understand this moment of inspired madness, you have to understand the two colossal figures at the center of the storm. One, a Roman general fighting for his very survival, and the other, a Gallic chieftain fighting for the soul of his people. The Roman was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was more than a general. He was a political animal, an author, and an architect of empire whose ambition was matched only by his audacity. For 8 years, he had carved a bloody path through Gaul, but his success had made him powerful enemies back in Rome. Powerful senators saw a potential tyrant, a man whose loyal, battle-hardened army could one day be turned against the Republic itself. Caesar knew this. He was deep in debt, his political career was on the line, and failure in Gaul meant ruin, exile, or even death. He was fighting for his very survival. The man who had forced this desperate gamble was Vercingetorix. He was the impossible made real, a leader who had forged a unified nation from 100 warring tribes. Where others saw only chaos and ancient rivalries, he saw the potential for unity. In secret councils held deep within sacred forests, his impassioned speeches stirred the hearts of chieftains who had been enemies for generations. He argued that their freedom was worth more than their feuds, that only together could they hope to drive out the Roman invaders. In a symbolic act of immense power, he cast down his own hereditary claim to leadership and was instead elected commander-in-chief of all Gallic armies, a title that had never before existed. He was the living embodiment of a united Gaul, and he had proven to be a terrifyingly effective commander. He unleashed a brutal, scorched earth campaign, ordering his own people to burn their towns, their fields, and their granaries. Anything that could not be defended was to be put to the torch, denying Caesar's legions food, forage, and shelter. The strategy was devastatingly effective. Roman soldiers, gaunt and starving, marched through a desolate, smoking landscape, their supply wagons empty, their morale plummeting. Vercingetorix was bleeding the eagle, feather by feather. The chase across central Gaul had been brutal. After a punishing campaign, Vercingetorix made a rare miscalculation. Believing the Romans to be in full retreat, he launched an attack on their marching column. He unleashed his heavy cavalry, the pride of the Gallic nobility, thousands of armored horsemen confident of their victory. But Caesar had a secret weapon. He deployed his German cavalry, mercenaries renowned for their ferocity and unorthodox tactics, who fought with a savage intensity that shocked the more refined Gallic nobles. The Gallic charge was broken, and their elite cavalry shattered. This tactical defeat forced Vercingetorix's hand. He could no longer risk a battle in the open field. He led his 80,000 remaining warriors to the fortress of Alesia, perched atop a high plateau, with steep, impassable river valleys on two sides. It was a defender's dream. From these strong walls, Vercingetorix watched Caesar's legions limp into the valley below. He had enough food to last a month, and he had sent riders to every corner of the land, carrying a simple, urgent message. Gaul is united. Now, march. March, and destroy the Romans forever. His strategy was simple and brilliant. He and his 80,000 warriors were the bait. Caesar would be forced to besiege him, and while the Romans were pinned down, the massive Gallic relief army would arrive and crush him from the rear. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Caesar stood before the formidable hill fortress, his legions exhausted, his officers uneasy. In the Roman Council of War, his legates argued for a strategic withdrawal. But Caesar, looking at the same cliffs and walls, saw an opportunity born of pure, breathtaking audacity. Retreat, he argued, would be seen as a sign of weakness and would only embolden the Gallic Union. There was only one path, forward. He then gave an order so insane it bordered on madness. If the mountain would not fall, he would build a new one around it. His plan was to erect not one, but two massive rings of fortifications. The first, an inner wall 11 miles long, would face the fortress. This was the circumvallation, but Caesar knew the real threat was the storm gathering behind him. So, he ordered a second, even larger wall to be built facing outwards, a 13-mile ring of death designed to hold off the 250,000 Gauls marching to relieve the fortress. This was the contravallation. Caesar was knowingly, methodically, imprisoning his own army between two massive enemy forces. This is the moment that reveals the true nature of the Roman legion. They were not just soldiers, they were the most effective and disciplined construction corps the world had ever seen. 60,000 men, who just days before had been fighting for their lives, now picked up shovels, axes, and saws. The valley of Alesia was transformed into a colossal construction site. The systematic deforestation of the surrounding hillsides began as thousands of trees were felled to provide timber. The work was relentless, continuing day and night under the watchful eyes of their centurions. The legionaries, men from Italy, Spain, and Gaul itself, worked with a methodical efficiency that was a weapon in its own right. They dug deep trenches, some 20 feet wide, diverting the nearby rivers to create impassable moats. Behind these, they erected a 12-foot rampart of earth and timber, topped with a palisade and fortified with towers every 80 feet, from which artillery pieces like ballistae could rain down death. But the true genius lay in the horrifying defenses hidden in the ground before the wall, a multi-layered killing field. They planted 5 rows of sharpened stakes, their tips just visible above the ground, called sippi. In front of those, they dug rows of camouflaged pits, 3 feet deep, each containing a fire-hardened wooden stake, which the soldiers grimly nicknamed Lilia, or lilies, for the way they blossomed with death for any who stumbled into them. And in front of the lilies, they buried logs studded with barbed iron hooks called stimuli, or spurs, designed to cripple any man or horse that stepped on them. The defenses were a death trap of wood and iron, but the Romans were about to discover that the greatest threat to their survival wasn't a Gallic spear. It was the very land they were stripping bare. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix and his men could only watch in a mixture of awe and growing horror as this impossible fortress rose from the earth with terrifying speed. Their attempts to harass the construction crews with cavalry raids were futile. The Romans would form a disciplined shield wall, repel the attack, and then immediately return to their digging, their rhythm barely broken. The ring of steel was closing, and the hope of an easy victory was turning to a creeping dread. As the final sections of the outer wall were put into place, scouts brought the news Caesar had been expecting. The Gallic relief army had arrived. The trap was now complete, but it was the Romans who were sealed inside, a small, determined island in a sea of enemies, waiting for an apocalypse of their own making. Weeks have now passed, and inside Alesia, confident defiance has curdled into the gnawing dread of starvation. The initial certainty of a quick relief has faded with each passing day. The last of the grain is gone, the livestock long since slaughtered. The silence of the siege is broken only by the cries of hungry children and the low murmur of desperate men. In a grim council of war, a chieftain proposes the unthinkable, that they resort to cannibalism, consuming the old and the infirm to sustain the warriors. Vercingetorix rejects this horrific idea, but the alternative he chooses is only slightly less brutal. He decides he must conserve every last scrap of food for his fighting men. He believed his choice was a necessary, even humane act of war. He was wrong. What he did next was so horrific, it would be remembered as a stain on his legacy for 1,000 years. He ordered all non-combatants, the civilians of Alesia, the women, the children, and the elderly, to be expelled from the fortress. What followed was a tragedy that would haunt the valley forever. A slow, heartbreaking procession of thousands of people made its way from the gates of Alesia. They were the families of the very warriors who now stood on the walls, watching them leave. They stumbled towards the Roman lines, a mass of desperate humanity, begging to be accepted as slaves, to be given a crust of bread, anything in exchange for their lives. But Caesar was as ruthless as he was brilliant. Accepting them would mean feeding them, a drain on his own precious supplies. In a calculated act of psychological warfare, he gave the order that no one was to be allowed through his lines. They were to be left where they were. Vercingetorix, his own resources dwindling, would not take them back. And so, in the no-man's land between the Gallic walls and the Roman lines, they were trapped. For days, their pleas and cries echoed across the valley as they slowly starved to death, in plain sight of their husbands, their fathers, and their sons. Just as the last of these poor souls fell silent, a new sound filled the air. It started as a low rumble, then grew into the thunder of a million voices and a forest of horns. On the hills to the west, the Gallic relief army appeared. It was a sight of terrible majesty, 250,000 strong, the largest army Gaul had ever produced. A sea of banners, boars, bears, and eagles created a riot of color above a forest of flashing spearheads that stretched to the horizon. They were the embodiment of Gallic hope, a tidal wave of fresh, eager warriors come to annihilate the Roman invaders. From their prison of wood and earth, the 60,000 Romans watched them arrive. They were hopelessly, catastrophically outnumbered. On one side, 80,000 starving but desperate men. On the other, 250,000 fresh troops. Caesar moved among his men, his expression calm, his voice steady. He inspected the lines, spoke to the centurions, and projected an aura of absolute confidence that steadied the nerves of his trapped army. The Romans were exhausted and trapped, but Caesar had one final advantage the Gauls knew nothing about, and it was hiding in plain sight. The silence is shattered by a unified roar from two directions at once. From inside, Alesia, Vercingetorix's warriors swarm from the gates, their desperation giving them a ferocious strength, crashing against the inner wall. Almost simultaneously, the massive relief army surges forward, a living wave of fury breaking against the outer defenses. For the Romans trapped between them, the final battle has begun. There is nowhere to run. Every direction leads to a fight for survival. The first assaults are a chaotic tapestry of courage and carnage. The Gauls throw themselves at the fortifications, using ladders and grappling hooks, filling the trenches with earth and the bodies of their fallen comrades, trying to claw their way up the ramparts. The Roman lines are stretched thin, with soldiers fighting back to back, a whirlwind of steel and discipline against a tide of sheer numbers. The hidden traps do their gruesome work. Under the cover of darkness, a more coordinated night assault begins. The air is filled with the terrifying sounds of battle fought in near-total blackness, the clang of steel, the thud of arrows into wooden shields, the screams of men falling into the hidden pits, the eerie light of fire arrows arcing through the sky. After days of relentless pressure, Gallic scouts discover a flaw in Caesar's grand design. In the north, the Roman lines had to be built over a steep, rocky hill, where the terrain made it impossible to construct the elaborate trenches and traps that fortified the rest of the circle. It is the weak point. The Gallic commanders gather their forces for a single, concentrated, and decisive assault. 60,000 of their best warriors, under the command of Vercingetorix's cousin, are tasked with a single objective: punch through the northern line and break the siege. As this main assault begins, Vercingetorix launches a perfectly timed, all-out attack from within, throwing his starving warriors against the weakened inner wall. The Roman defenders in the northern sector are on the verge of collapse. But now, Caesar takes personal command of the battle. His iconic scarlet cloak, worn specifically for this purpose, makes him a visible beacon of defiance as he rides through the carnage. He is everywhere at once, rallying wavering cohorts, personally leading reserves to plug the gaps. At one point, seeing a line falter, he dismounts, grabs a shield from a fallen soldier, and fights in the front rank as a common legionary, his presence shaming the weary men into holding their ground. But even he can't be everywhere. The northern line is breaking. Men are falling back, the disciplined Roman line beginning to fray. In this desperate hour, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, Caesar makes his final, audacious gamble. He gathers his elite German cavalry, the 400 horsemen whose savage charge had started this whole chain of events, and gives them to his most trusted commander, Titus Labienus. The order is simple and suicidal. Ride out of the fortifications, make a wide, perilous circuit of the entire battlefield, and slam into the rear of the 60,000 Gauls attacking the northern hill. It is an all-or-nothing move that will either save them all or doom them completely. As Labienus and his cavalry disappear into the chaos, the battle for the northern hill reaches its horrifying climax. The Romans are pushed back to their final rampart. It looks like the end. As the northern Roman line buckles and begins to collapse, a new sound cuts through the chaos of battle, the thunder of hooves where no hooves should be. Titus Labienus and the German cavalry appear over the ridge behind the Gallic assault force. They are a terrifying sight, riding hard, their guttural war cries adding a new, horrifying sound to the din of battle. The Gauls, caught completely by surprise, their attention fixed on the wall in front of them, are thrown into panic and confusion. An attack from the rear is every soldier's worst nightmare. It shatters their formation and their morale in a single catastrophic instant. Seeing the tide turn, the exhausted Roman defenders let out a final desperate cheer and countercharge with the last of their strength. The great Gallic assault, the final hope of Vercingetorix, collapses into a bloody, chaotic rout. The panic is contagious. Seeing their elite force broken and fleeing, the rest of the massive relief army loses heart. 250,000 men, the largest Gallic army ever assembled, dissolves into a terrified mob, its warriors scattering in every direction, hunted down for miles by Caesar's cavalry. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix watches his dream of a free Gaul die in a storm of dust and fleeing men. He knows it is over. The next day, a profound silence hangs over the valley, a landscape of death and discarded weapons. The victorious Romans, caked in blood and dirt, are too exhausted to even celebrate. Vercingetorix summons his council for the last time. He tells them he fought not for his own fortune, but for their common liberty, and now, to appease the Romans, he must be delivered to them, living or dead. He then dons his finest, most ornate armor, mounts his warhorse, and rides out of the gates of Alesia alone. He circles Caesar's camp in a final, defiant gesture before riding directly to the seated general. He dismounts, and without a word, he unfastens his sword, his helmet, and his armor, and lays them at Caesar's feet. As that sword clattered on the ground, the Gallic rebellion died with it. But this was more than the end of a war. It was the birth of an empire. Caesar didn't just see a defeated enemy, he saw the key to his own destiny. This single victory would give him the wealth and the unwavering loyalty of an army that would allow him to cross the Rubicon, dismantle the Republic, and forge an empire from the ashes. The price of this victory was brutal. The 50,000 surviving defenders of Alesia were given as property to Caesar's legionaries, one slave for every soldier. Vercingetorix himself would be held in a Roman prison for 6 years before being paraded through the streets in Caesar's triumph and then ritually strangled. The Battle of Alesia was the brutal, bloody birth of Roman Gaul, a province that would be part of the Roman world for 5 centuries, its culture and language laying the very foundation for modern France. It was a battle that claimed the lives of a generation of Gallic warriors, but it was also the crucible that forged an emperor. It stands today as a timeless testament to how history is made not just by the largest armies, but by discipline, by engineering, and by the sheer, indomitable will of a single brilliant mind. What piece of history do you think deserves to be told with this level of detail? Let us know in the comments below, and your suggestion might become our next deep dive into the battles that shaped our world. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story from history's most epic moments. Thanks for watching.